All right, welcome to my podcast. My name is Luke Ty. I'm currently enrolled in Edu 333. I'm joined by my good friends Vincent and Emil, who also enjoy playing video games, and I trust they'll be very knowledgeable on the topics we'll talk about today. So thank you two for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
I know I just introduced them, and they'll have excellent commentary later, but for now I'm going to have to do some background housekeeping. So first of all, I'll introduce the topic we're going to talk about today, which would be, does video game violence cause and or have an effect on real-life violence? It's a very polarizing topic, one with two very clear sides, but before we talk about those sides, I'd like to first define the definition of violence. So one researcher named Christopher Ferguson defines violence as intentional behavior produced to cause considerable physical harm to another person who contrastingly wishes to avoid them. So I think the key point we want to see from that is that violence refers to intentionally wanting to cause harm to someone or something other than yourself. And that's the definition we're going to assume during these discussions going further. Alright, so with that out of the way, back to the topic at hand. Does video game violence have an effect on real-life violence? Researchers such as James G., which we discussed in class, and Christopher Ferguson think not. As we will discuss later, these two actually think the opposite, that video game violence may actually have positive benefits, such as being an outlet for managing anger and aggression. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have researchers such as Bushman and Anderson and Dill, who have claimed to conducted experiments that link video game violence, even violence in media, to real-life violence. They've also coined the general aggression model, which states that violent media in games leads to short-term aggression, which can eventually lead to permanent changes in one's personality over time. With that being said, my claim on the matter is that video game violence has no effect on real-life violence. I strongly feel this way. I really feel there is no link between the two. And now, what do you guys think about the matter?
So I agree in the sense that there's, in my opinion, no substantial evidence that can confirm it. Now, I can only describe what I've observed, from my point of view. And I've seen two sides of the coin where I have a lot of friends who also play video games, and they're perfectly fine, normal human beings, right? And on the other hand, I also have other friends who also play video games and tend to be a little more hyper-aggressive, if you want to call it, though I don't know if that's a product of them having played video games or rather just their nature and their characteristics.
Sure.
Yeah, for me, my belief is that there is no link between video game violence and real-life violence. That's from my own experience playing video games and from seeing it from friends and close family members. Again, that's my own experience, but I do believe there's no link to real-world violence. Right,
and I think all three of us are, fully functional adults who do enjoy playing video games with a reasonable amount of violence, and I'm assumedly saying that we've all turned out fine, so I guess we'll see. So we'll begin our arguments by first talking about the experiments I mentioned by Bushman and Anderson and Dill. We're going to mainly focus on countering these experiments and poking holes in them. So I'll first begin by describing what these studies entailed. So the first experiment by Bushman and Anderson in 2009 took 320 college students, 160 male, 160 female. They randomly split them into two groups and had each play either a violent or a non-violent game for 20 minutes. And afterwards, the participants were told that the study was over. So as they were leaving the building, they were exposed to pre-recorded audio of a fight, a staged fight. So they would hear like a violent fight. And as the participant would turn the corner or leave the building, they would see the supposed victim of the fight just laying there in pain, which in actuality it was just an actor. So the real study was timing how long it took each person to help the injured victim. According to this study, on average, it took violent the people who play the violent game longer to help at 73 seconds on average versus the non-violent people at 16 seconds. We should also note that apparently between the two groups of non-violent and violent quote-unquote gamers, about 25% in each group actually helped the person. So you guys get what I mean by that? So so basically like in each group, only a fourth of the people actually helped.
Right.
But it was the same percentage in either group, whether they played the violent or non-violent game.
It's just a matter of who took longer.
Exactly, who took longer.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much all I have to say in terms of prefacing that experiment. So what do you guys think of that at first glance?
This is already setting off a bunch of red flags for me personally. I mean, let's put aside the fact that these people played games or not, okay? Each person in general, given their personality and characteristics, is going to react differently to real world, violence, okay? And like I said, I have friends who play violent video games. Wouldn't hurt a fly. We've been outside in certain altercations we've witnessed where they've been in complete shock, unable to do anything, even though they've been exposed to certain violence through media and video games. And now, who's to say that the people who played the violent video games were of that particular characteristic where they were in shock when, experiencing that reality.
I'm glad
that
you made
violence,
that point.
Right?
Yeah.
And those who played the non-violent video games, they, you never know with
exactly,
people
because this situation is definitely not normal to witness a fight in public. I've actually written that exact point down, so I'm glad you mentioned it. But it's like people are just going to react differently to these types of situations, and it's like many people, I'm sure, have probably never even been exposed to a fight. They probably have no idea how to react to this sort of thing.
And how are they supposed to know if that person was the victim or the perpetrator, right? Maybe somebody managed to defend themselves, and then run off, and now this dude's laying on the floor. How do I know?
That's a great point too. The study, I forgot to mention that the study claims that the participants should have felt no quote-unquote perceived danger, because in the audio recording, it's apparently made clear that the attacker left the building, right? But who's to say that the attacker doesn't come back?
Yeah, with the gun or something.
Exactly, you don't know that. So it's like this. I feel like this experiment is very biased in that aspect.
It is. I don't think it was conducted very well in that regard, because you never know with people. Complex human beings with different emotions and architects of their brains are going to react to these types of situations. So that's kind of how I feel about that one.
Also, I wanted to say that based on the findings of the experiment, the study tried to make a conclusion saying that violent people, or rather people who played violent games, take longer to perceive violence. So basically, they're trying to say that people who play violent games are desensitized to violence, which is why they didn't help the injured.
Now, what was the time frame on those again? How long?
It was 73 seconds on average for the people who played the violent game versus 16 seconds for the people who played the non-violent game. But before you say anything, I wanted to say that I feel like their conclusion is a bit counterintuitive, because they're saying that the people who have played violent video games take longer to, perceive violence. I feel like that's counterintuitive, because I feel like if you have consumed violent video games, played them a lot, you should theoretically be the most knowledgeable on like the harms of violence, the dangers of violence. These people theoretically might have been the most scared to help this person upon hearing this fight. So I feel like their findings were counterintuitive in that aspect.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I mean, when you have 75% from each group who don't even actually do anything.
That's a great point too. I didn't even have that. That's a great point, dude. Thanks for bringing that up. Like, a large sample size didn't even do anything. So it's like, how can we even find these test results conclusive at all? It just seems very niche, very specific.
Yeah, and it's an odd way to test it.
Exactly. Yeah. Very odd. I feel like a more... because as we were talking about, a fight is a very uncommon situation, right? I feel like a better experiment would be to test to see if someone's aggressive tendencies changed over a long period of time or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because like this is like a one and done thing. Like you're exposing this person to such a shock, and you're trying to extract data from that. It really makes no sense.
Because you expose somebody, you know, a random civilian, whether they've played, let's say they haven't played violent video games before, you expose them to one, they might like it or not, whatever, and then you have them go through this experiment. You're not going to get substantial data from this. You know, I feel like they probably benefit more from a long period of collected data, which is difficult to do.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah, exactly. But I do agree that would have been a better route. Right. All right, so that was very insightful on the first study. We're going to move on to the second study now, again by the same two, Bushman and Anderson, 2009. Actually, the same paper. The same paper had two experiments. This is the second one, so it involved 162 adult moviegoers. Again, they were split into two groups, and one group watched a violent movie, and another group watched a non-violent movie. And they had an actor, after the movie, they had an actor, a woman, who appeared to be injured. So I guess she had like a cast on her leg or something, and she had crutches. And she drops her crutches in front of the participants. So the study involved recording how long it took each participant to help the woman pick up her crutches. And the study found that it took 26% longer for the people who saw the violent movie to help the woman pick up her crutches. So this experiment is much more concise. That's pretty much all I have to say for now. So what do you guys think about that?
It seems like these people are just pulling at strings.
Yeah.
It's such a weird way to approach the topic, in my opinion.
Right.
Okay. Now let me give you an example of it. So let's say I go to the movies with my dad or my mom. She doesn't watch a lot of action movies, but I told her this one might be fun. It'll just be a cool thing to watch. We go there, we watch it. You know, I'm maybe an avid action movie goer, and she is not, but she enjoyed the movie, as she has before. Now we walk out of the theater, and some lady drops her crutches, and either I help her or my mom helps her, right? Now, these people are using this similar set of data pool to determine whether, it took these people longer to help out or not. But you don't know, once again, these people, if they're avid action movie goers or not, and how their brains work and all that stuff.
Right.
To be able to determine, they've been desensitized by violence, therefore more unlikely to help this person out who has dropped their crutches. Now, you also said that it took them, 26% longer?
26% longer.
What are the actual numbers?
Yes,
in the
I'm
report?
very glad you mentioned that. Yes, I have those numbers. So, the numbers are, it took the people who saw the violent movie 6.89 seconds to help versus the people who saw the non-violent movie 5.46 seconds. So that's a 1.43 second differential. This is less than 1.5 seconds a difference on average. So not even like a person, like this is just on average.
Right, but the way they framed it, once
Exactly.
again, to support their claim, which I understand, you want to frame things to support your claim so you can get people to actually read your paper and all that stuff. But once again, that kind of difference is not big enough of a difference to make a good conclusion in my
Right, and this is actually a very somewhat common strategy in writing articles, research articles. It's called reporting bias, where you selectively reveal or suppress information to support your claim. So obviously they have the data, right? The 6.89 seconds versus 5.46 seconds. They could have easily just said those two numbers and let us, the reader, draw our own conclusions. But they framed it in such a way to better support their argument by saying it took 26% longer. Because frankly, 26% longer to help an injured woman sounds way worse than saying it took only 1.5 seconds longer.
Exactly. And that's why I say they're pulling at like straws here, because and it seems like there's not enough evidence to prove that violence in video games translates to violence in reality because of some of these experiments that we're looking at here. They're so obscure, so niche. Right. Because I guess it's very difficult to pinpoint an exact cause for this type of violence, or if it's even linked together. And so they're just trying to find ways to piece it together, or they're just trying to make money, for
Yeah.
their reports. You never know.
Exactly.
So, but that's my
Yeah, I'm on a similar opinion as well. This experiment doesn't seem very conclusive to me at all. To me, in my opinion, it seems like they're clearly pulling at straws.
Right.
I don't know how you can arrive at a conclusion like that. Obviously, there's a 1 second difference. You don't know what kind of people they are, what their perceptions are, personality,
Exactly.
all those types of things. I don't know how you can actually link an experiment like that to violence, depending on what kind of movie you watch. It seems just a very weird way to go about it,
Right.
to try and prove your point.
And going even further on that, I mentioned reporting bias previously, and I think it's a good point to mention that, like I said, this experiment appeared on the same paper as the last experiment conducted by the same two, Bushman and Anderson. So I feel like the fact that they've kind of used reporting bias in this experiment somewhat invalidates their previous experiment, because now we don't know, like, what have they said in the previous experiment.
What are they hiding?
Yeah, exactly. What are they hiding? Trying to support their claim. Like, there's probably many other factors.
Yeah, and both these people are saying that violence is caused by video games, right?
Yeah, or at least plays some factor.
So
in that, yes.
they're both of the same opinion doing these experiments.
Right.
So, in a way, they're both in a bias. There's not a different opinion to help them maybe look at the things that may not be working in these experiments. They should have had maybe...
that is true. There's no one correcting them or saying.
Yeah, and this is kind of off topic, but somewhat related. Sometimes these people have a sense of urgency to get their reports out because they need to make money, right? They're psychologists, professional psychologists in the world, and so sometimes they have to make reports like these kind of half-baked, hidden agenda-esque reports just to get it published, get some money, to be able to...
I do believe there's actually like a term for that. I believe we've learned it in class. I'll look it up. I'll include it in the supplemental paper I write for this, but I've heard that when you write a paper like this, it's very rare for them to come out with a neutral stance. They always take an extreme because they want to, not even a natural bias, but they want to have a firm, final conclusion to say, to say that, they like, in layman's terms, it's not exciting to have a result be neutral. They always want to strongly find something, and I feel like that might have happened here. And one more point I also wanted to bring up. Again, related to the first experiment, we talked about how shocking it would be to see two people fighting in the first experiment. And remember that in that experiment, only 25% of people even helped the victim. Whereas in this experiment, every single moviegoer helped the woman pick up her crutches. Every single one. So I think that just goes to show that in this experiment, since the scenario was not so outlandish, that everyone was willing to help, whereas in the first experiment, a lot of people were just so shocked, unable to respond to that, which again discredits their previous study. So I feel like this whole paper in general is a bit faulty. Yeah,
I agree.
All right, so that ends our discussion on the Bushman and Anderson studies. We're going to move on now to a study conducted by Anderson and Dill in 2000. It involved 210 psychology students. I believe they were told if they participated, they would get extra credit. I'm not sure if that will play a huge factor in our discussion, but anyways, they were split into two groups, very similarly to the previous experiments. They each played either a violent video game or a non-violent video game. After they played the game, the participant was asked to play a competitive game based on reaction time, and I believe the game just involved pressing a button faster than your opponent. So the winner of each round would get to punish the loser, and by punish I mean that the winner could subject the loser to a loud noise. and the winner could specifically choose how loud and how long the noise would be when subjected to the loser. That all being said, the competitive game was not competitive at all. The opponent that the participant was playing against was actually just a computer, and the game was rigged to have the participant always win 13 times and lose 12 times. So they ran it 25 times. Whenever the participant would lose, they would be subjected to a noise randomly generated by the computer, and the computer would randomly pick the loudness and the length of the noise. So the results of this experiment showed that the people who played the violent game would set punishments for their opponent to be louder and longer noises. And I believe that's it for the preface, so do you guys have anything to say on that?
This one is an interesting one because I do have one example. So there's a game, PlayerUnknown Battleground,
PlayerUnknown
that we
Battlegrounds.
have played before.
Right, yes.
And the people on those servers tend to act like wild animals at times.
Oh, yeah, that's...
But this can be taken more to inherent human behavior, right?
Sure.
Whether humans are inherently bad or good. And, you know, violent video games seem to me more to be an outlet for something like that as opposed to an instigator for it to be reciprocated in reality. So this one is kind of interesting to me because I feel as if it's exposing more the human nature than it would be whether violent video games itself are affecting, you know, how people behave or not. And once again, it's hard for me to say that it does cause violence in reality because you don't know the person. You don't know how they react to certain stimuli, right? Each person is unique in that aspect.
Right.
So how can you then determine? It's very hard to get a neutral person, right? Somebody who doesn't fall under one category or another, and create a conclusion based off of putting them through a series of tests like that, because you're gonna have people who grow up to be shy, think a certain way, and others who are hyper aggressive and tend to think other ways. So I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this one, but I feel like once again it's just kind of odd that they're choosing these types of experiments to draw their conclusions. Right? They could have potentially gone to some other experiment to test the person's aggression when presented with certain stimuli, depending on whether they've been playing violent video games their whole life, as opposed to those who have not, you know, but rather than just take random people who know nothing about their history in that sense, throw them in a room, put them through this test, and then try to draw some conclusion from your samples. So
very good points. My main gut reaction when I read this is that, like I said, the opponent was a computer.
Yeah.
And it was random whether they would win or lose. They would lose and win a set number of times, right? But it was random whether they would win or lose. So imagine a scenario where the guy's playing, right? And he loses let's say 5 times in a row, and the computer sets his punishment to be obnoxiously loud, obnoxiously long, just consecutively. Is it not reasonable to assume that this person would retaliate back by also, producing a loud and long noise?
This kind of reminds me of an experiment that was conducted with some monkeys. They had 2 monkeys in a cage. Now, I'm not comparing humans to monkeys. It's similar in the sense that, from what I remember, one would complete an objective and he'd get a grape or a cucumber, which they like, right?
Yeah.
One of the two. The other one, he'd complete the objective, but they started to give him a nut or a cucumber, something not sweet or that they would prefer. And they had him side by side in these cages where they could see each other. So the other monkey knew that the first monkey was getting grapes each time, right? Even when he wasn't completing an objective, he was still giving him the grapes.
Yeah.
And he started to get pissed off because in a sense he was losing, right? And after 5-6 consecutive times of not getting the grape, and only getting like a nut or a cucumber or whatever, you just start throwing and shaking the cage, getting
Right.
upset. You
Yeah,
know,
that's a good. That can tie back nicely to this. Yeah, like if you're being subjective to what you assume is, you know, wrongdoing, of course you're going to want to, quote unquote, fight back. You know, do what you can, and all you can in this scenario is, you know, increase the punishment you inflict. So I feel like that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, all this experiment is measuring is just how annoyed a person is, basically, in this scenario.
Right. Exactly.
It's
I
not
totally
really
agree.
measuring the violence associated with a video game or anything. It's
Right.
just measuring how someone would react to a noise.
That's a great
essentially.
point. That's a great point to make because as I described before starting this, it's like it's just making a noise in retaliation. You know, who's to say that like these participants weren't even annoyed? They just thought it was like a friendly competition.
He could have slammed the button. He could have reacted in so many.
Yeah, like he could be laughing like, oh, ha, that guy, you know, gave me a loud punishment. I'll just do the same. You know, this is a fun thing. You know, who's to say that? This data was not given. It wasn't. They weren't saying like, oh, this guy angrily set the noise.
Yeah.
You know, exactly.
It's very strange. And like I said, they approach these experiments.
There's a few other points of bias I wanted to talk about too about this experiment. First of all, being observation bias, which is just the fact that the participants may have acted more or less aggressive due to the nature of them being observed, the nature of it being an experiment in general. Because these students knew that a psychology experiment was being conducted. They didn't know the true nature. They didn't know they were studying the effects of the game on their behavior, but they knew it was related to behavior. They knew it was psychology, so perhaps
so that's going to affect the way
exactly
that
how they act.
Yeah,
because they knew.
Yeah, if you know how IQ tests are conducted and you're practicing beforehand, you can use that to your advantage, kind of manipulate the way you answer certain questions, because you know, in a sense, how you want them to be answered.
So really, this test, I think it's
inconclusive.
Yeah, inconclusive. I think it's a quote-unquote better than the previous two. I personally felt like the previous two were extremely flawed. Yeah. This one has...
at least it was going somewhere.
Yeah, it's going somewhere. I don't want to say it has complete merit, at least in my opinion, but it's a small step, extremely small step in the right direction, maybe.
I said, it's very odd, these experiments that they pick.
Exactly. It seems like it's very difficult to measure this type of thing in terms of any quantifiable, reliable metrics. So they're just kind of grasping at straws, trying to extract any information they can from these wildly weird experiments.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
Okay. All right, so that's going to conclude our counter arguments. Now we are going to provide our own evidence as to why we believe there is no link between video game violence and real life violence. In fact, we might even talk about why video game violence might have a positive effect on people. So the first point I wanted to talk about was from a paper by Christopher Ferguson. He collected data from 1996 to 2006, and it actually shows that as the number of video games sold increased over those years, youth crime decreased. Which is a very interesting correlation to see. Now, should obviously note that correlation does not necessitate causation, but I do believe we can provide some insight as to why this may be the case. The first thing I want to talk about is that I think video games, or particularly violent video games, can be very easily accessible outlets for people to manage their feelings of anger, aggression, perhaps even depression, and this may have played a factor in lowering the crime rate during those years. What do you guys think about?
Yeah, I actually, funny enough, came across a really good example for this one too. So there's one instructor at the gym I teach at, so I teach self-defense called Krav Maga, which is one of the most brutal forms of contact combat out there, but used, modified for citizens to defend themselves, right? And I work with this one instructor, Madeline, and she was just today actually telling me how she she's always switched on mentally. She always has to be switched on because she works multiple jobs. She's a kindergarten teacher in Detroit, so she's always working with kids. She's got to be high energy, and active in the brain. And then from there, she goes straight to the gym. And once again, has to teach kids and adults and train. So her brain is always actively engaged. And she was telling me how she felt mentally exhausted. She never really has a chance to let loose, in a sense, except for this past weekend, where she had a chance to play a video game called Borderlands with her boyfriend.
Right.
And she played that for a couple of hours, and she said it was just this outlet that I really needed. You know, it was kind of mindless in a sense, right? To where she didn't have to think about it too much. She just played it for her own enjoyment, and it was enough to get her to kind of relax a little bit, which I wholeheartedly, agree with, that it can definitely be used as an outlet for relaxation, to help with depression. It certainly helped others, and aggression as well, for those who are naturally aggressive.
Right.
Yeah, for me, I can only offer just my own personal experience. When playing video games, for me, if I'm angry or something, it does serve as an outlet to get those emotions out. For me, it's just a time to sit down, relax, forget about maybe the troubles of the day, any bad things that may have happened, and just enjoy the time you're playing and maybe get those feelings out towards the game, whatever it may be you're playing. That's essentially, for me, what in my opinion, on this matter. I think it does serve as a good outlet for any feelings that you may be experiencing, and just get them out of the way so they don't interfere with your day, those feelings of anger or other things that may hinder you.
Right. So thank you guys. Vince had a very good anecdote. Emil pretty much has the same viewpoint as I do. I was pretty much going to say the exact same thing. So thank you so much for stealing my thunder there. But anyways, I will move on to the next point. I did want to acknowledge a common thing I see a lot in media and amongst student chatter in the classroom, actually, that they say that some people, like certain people, are definitely more impressionable and are certainly affected by violence in video games, which I will acknowledge is true. That being said, I personally feel like these people they could be considered outliers in the data set, perhaps, because I feel like any, mature, sane, normal adult would not be affected in the same way that these types of people are. These people may have, weaker psyches, mentalities, etc., that cause them to just absorb what they see in violent media and translate that to real life, which obviously there cannot be 100% success rate in not translating that. There's always going to be some people that take that type of stuff to heart, but I think those types of people are outliers, a small number, not too crazy.
Yeah, I just wanted to close my opinions on the matter personally,
right,
with another personal anecdote.
Right.
So I'll use myself once again as an example. Once again, I teach this form of self-defense, right? I'm no stranger to violence in the real world. In that respect, I train this, I teach people to defend themselves through whatever means necessary, whether it's gouging the dude's eyes out, kicking him in the nuts. There are no rules on the street. It's live or die, right?
Sure.
Now, there have been times, one instance at work where there was some altercation going downstairs. We're on the second floor. And so, naturally, I go down there, initially thinking, okay, I'm going to see if I can keep the peace, see what's going on, while one of my employers called the police because they were stirring some trouble. And I'm not going to lie, I was standing there watching this kind of go down. No fighting or anything, just exchange of words. I was scared. Of all this training and fighting and beatings I've taken, I was legitimately scared, and I was hoping that nothing happened. And this is coming from a guy, once again, who fights for a living, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who plays violent video games all my life, right? and yet when I was presented with a real potential physical violence situation, I almost fell short, you know. Now, whether that has to do with my training or not is a separate argument in itself, but in terms of video games and stuff, I mean, I think it speaks for itself.
Sure.
You know, each human is a complex organism that reacts differently to certain stimuli, and I think it's just very difficult to come to a concrete conclusion with this type of claim.
Right.
But that's my opinion on the
I think,
whole
yeah,
matter.
in that situation, I think it's only human to react like that. You know, I don't think. I definitely think that's a great point to bring up for this argument. You know, you've obviously played violent video games your whole life, and you know, like you said, you fight. But when presented with such a violent scenario, you know, you wouldn't. I would say he didn't react the way that certain researchers we've talked about today would have expected him to react.
Yeah, I was not by any means ready to jump in there and beat this guy up. I was excited to put my training in practice. No, I was actually genuinely scared.
All right. So, okay, this is the last point I'd like to make on the matter, and that would be that violence in video games typically occurs for a reason in games. So I'm going to talk about a few concepts we learned in class. So the first being G's principle of identity. That talks about how when you're playing a video game, you become more engaged with the game's mechanics, playing the game if you become invested in the characters, the story, the lore of the game. And the second thing I want to talk about is the self-determination theory, specifically autonomy, which talks about how when you're playing a game, if you perceive that your actions in the game have significant impact on the narrative, the game itself, it also makes you become more engaged in playing the game. So I feel like those two work hand in hand in terms of video game violence to both like contextualize violence and make sure that the violence is used tactfully, makes sense. So for example, like usually a very stereotypical example is like, I don't know, Mario, where you're like literally like killing monsters, but you're doing so to save a princess. You know, it's contextualized. You're not literally going around killing people for no reason, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, those types of games that employ those violent tendencies typically tend to be frowned upon in the gaming community.
They don't do well.
Yeah, exactly. So I've got two examples of that. The first one being Hatred, which is a game that came out in 2015. And the premise of that game is literally just, you're just like a, what are you, like a...
You're just a shooter.
Yeah.
The protagonist, as far as I remember, just has a disdain for society.
Right.
And he's talking about, everybody having to die,
Right.
and they're all worms. And
Yeah,
it's just
like literally your objective in that game is to kill as many people
before
as
you
possible
die.
before you get killed by the authorities, which is abhorrent, horrible, and justifiably the game was pulled from Steam by Valve. It was critically panned. It wasn't even a very good game.
People tore it to shreds.
Exactly. So that just goes to show that people who play violent video games, they still have standards. We're not all crazed savages out here. Yeah, exactly. So, all right. So that's gonna conclude the content of our podcast. We're just gonna close up with some concluding statements. So, to summarize, my personal claim as a student in Edu 333 is that I strongly disagree that violence in video games causes or has an effect on real-life violence. I believe this because, for one, a lot of the studies that claim this to be the case I feel are unreliable due to a variety of biases: reporting bias, observation bias, the experiments themselves being nonsensical, and in addition, I also believe that violence in video games might actually provide a positive benefit on people, such as being an outlet for anger, feelings of depression, etc. And there's also factual models that show that as the number of games sold has increased over the years, youth crime has decreased. So I mean, I feel like that's a very solid case on my behalf. Do you two have anything you'd like to say before we close out?
Yeah, just to recap, given my conclusions and personal, anecdote, it's very tough to measure this kind of thing. And I just think it's inconclusive because each human being is unique in that regard, and human beings are complex organisms, so it's very hard to pinpoint, what the cause of violence in reality is, or whether video games are, the cause of that or not.
Yeah, for me, the conclusion, again, is just a personal experience. Since I was a kid, I've been playing these types of games, violent video games. I've had friends who've played these games for a majority of their lives up to this point. And we've all been very normal people, no tendency for violence or anything like this. And I have no intention to hurt anyone or anything like that. So for me personally, I still firmly believe that it doesn't cause, video games don't have a link to actual violence.
All right, I definitely strongly agree with the both of you. I guess that's going to close us out for today. Thank you both for joining me on this school assignment. I know it's been a rough ride to talk about all this stuff, but thank you for taking the time out of your day to do this.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Why does he ask me if I know the return policy if they put it on the fucking receipt? Dollar ass shave.
Welcome to my
Sponsored by Dollar Ass Shave.
Sponsored by Dollar Ass Shave Club. For $3 a month, you can shave your ass. All right, let me think. I just want to know how I'm gonna say this.
Or what if we do this? Why don't you cut it into segments? You have your intro segment.
That's so
That's-
fucking.
where you
that's
set
perfect.
it up.
That's perfect.
That's smart.
That's so perfect.
And then we can start recording again, a second session, where
That's the
we're
way to
into
do this.
I do agree that would have been a better route. Right. All right, that's it for that one.
One and done, bitch.
That was
Right.
pretty
You
good.
hear that?
All right.
5, 6, 7, 8.
Study. So I feel like this whole paper in general is a bit faulty. Yeah.
I agree.
That's it.
That's a
All right.
I'm playing Halo 2 as I speak right now. And I have no intentions to hurt anybody. Oh, look, I just killed this alien fuck. He's dead now. But guess what?
Please.
I don't feel like punching anybody. In fact, I'm gonna go in my room, jerk off, and take a nap. I'm at...
Vince, what are you doing? Oh!
You know what? Come here, Luke. Hey.
Vince, please. Please. All right.
You gotta animate that audio now.
I wish I could.
Yeah, oh shit, it played too, see?
Yeah. I'll
I wanna
save
hear
that one.
that. I
I'll
wanna hear
save
this.
it.
That's funny.
All right.
Agree.
Okay.
God, that one's stupid too, man.
Ready? You guys?
Yes.
Is
I'm
it
ready.
good? Okay.
One more drink. One more drink.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll drink too. Then I piss my pants lower.
We're gonna have to stop the recording. I've just pissed myself.
I'm just trying to walk out of the room and Emil's like, dude, you pissed your pants.
Bro, he just pissed himself. You fucking
You
baby.
hear a thud. You're like, we're gonna have to stop the recording. Luke just passed out on the floor.
All right. You guys. I know it's been a rough ride to talk about all this stuff, but thank you for taking the time out of your day to do this.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, fuckers! Fuck! Shit! Upon ourselves.
I know.
This wasn't happening when
All
I
right.
first started.
I'm serious. I'm done now. I'm good.
It's okay. We'll try again, and if it doesn't work, then I'll change the diction. I'll figure something out. All right. It's recording. Okay, it's recording. All right, so it's a bit hard to start these things off cleverly, so I'll just begin bluntly. My name is Luke Tai. I'm currently enrolled in Edu 3. to me?